Good morning. Thank you for, good afternoon. It seems like morning after the extraordinary evening we had yesterday. Again, I'm really grateful for all the efforts that so many people in this room have put in to make this show possible. And this is a very exciting day for me. So I'm going to just tell you a little story, and I'm going to let Kendi make an introduction. I first came to Surrealism when I met Gordon Onslow Ford. He walked into the gallery because we were doing a show of Roberto Matta, and they'd been best friends all their life. And that was really the first time I got to work with a first-generation living European surrealist. It was the event of my life. But in researching Gordon's work, I came across a book called Surrealism in Exile by Martica, and it kind of changed my life. Everything I read and every image I looked at opened up a new world to me, and it kind of actually became, I don't want to use the word Bible because but I don't know how else to describe it. It became my Bible of collecting. It really became my Bible of my gallery. Everything I was excited about. It changed my universe. Some of you have been to my home. If you come to my home, you could actually call it the Surrealism in Exile collection. I have a wonderful Wolfgang Paulin. It's in Surrealism in Exile. I have a wonderful William Basiotes. It's in Surrealism in Exile. I have a wonderful Enrico Donati. You'll see it in Surrealism in Exile. And every time I find something in Surrealism in Exile, I get very, very excited because it has a very personal connection to me, because I feel like my calling kind of started as I read that book. So I hope that's not too much, Martica, but your work and the work you did to expose all of us to this connection of when, the Surrealism, started in Europe, and how it got to America is that it literally was exile. They all had to flee because all of the Surrealists were degenerate artists, and all of their lives were in danger. And I'm not going to go too much into this because Martica might, and you can ask questions about this. But Seligman, this is very poignant, because Seligman was really the first of the Surrealists to come and was so instrumental to bring all of the Surrealists here. But it was the exile of the European artists coming to America and interacting with the American artists that really led to so much of what happened with the New York School and the School of Abstract Expressionism, all of which was unknown to me until I read your book, Martica. And it so opened my eyes to a time of creativity in this explosion of Europe to America and all of that work just speaks so much to me. So I don't want to do an introduction. I just want to tell the story that this is an extraordinary moment for me, because I'm going to get to hear from Martica about something that has so changed my view of artwork and impassioned my view of artwork and my view both as a collector and as a gallerist. So thank you so much for being here, Martica. And before I turn the mic over to you, I want to give it to Kendi, because there actually probably is a formal introduction that should happen. So, and thank you all for being here.
So we've set this up really casually today because I, like Roland, if I had to pick one mentor, it would be this wonderful woman next to me. And I've learned so much from Martica. One of the things, because this show is so important to us, we wanted to do is share what she and I do on our visits to New York, where we go and have lunch together. That's why I've got some tea and some coffee, just like we do, and sit and talk about surrealism and art and what it means. And we couldn't have a better mentor for all of us than Martica, who not only wrote Surrealism in Exile, but has written about Masson, Palin, Tanguy, oh my gosh, it's going to go on and on and on and on. Basically, anybody in that time period, she's written about them all. A wonderful scholar as well, a teacher. And I think your life has never stopped being about the arts. So we thank you for your contribution, which has been a lifelong contribution. So what we're going to do is Martika's going to talk a little bit, and then what we'd really like to do is have you help us determine what direction you'd like this conversation to go. So jump in when you'd like to. I'm going to repeat some of your questions so that for long-term oral histories and posterity, we'll have it recorded. But otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, Martica Sawin.
Thank you so much, Kendi and Roland. What these two have accomplished is simply beyond belief to me. When I walked in here Friday afternoon after my plane from New York, I could not believe what had happened to what I had seen as isolated, sometimes in dark storage rooms and neglected paintings, how they had come to life and been transformed by being put in this setting with its marvelous light, its spaciousness, and where necessary, reframed, maybe cleaned, and so on. And to see so many of the paintings gathered together, because at the time that Kurt Seligmann's widow, Arlette, died, everything was dispersed. And Roland and Kendi, by sheer perseverance, managed to find enough paintings, following auctions, tracing down the track to one collector or another, or where you might find, and brought together this incredible assemblage of Kurt Seligmann paintings. There has never been, it's never happened before. And amazing that now, was it 40, 50, more than 50 years after his death, that this should take place. And how incredibly gratified he and his wife Arlette would have been to see this. It to me is totally phenomenal, and it really actually puts Seligmann in a whole new light for me, especially seeing this. I don't want to make you crane your necks, but hanging over the entrance there, this triptych, which has not been seen together as a unit since the late 50s, when it was shown this way at a gallery in New York. So I thought I would just start with just a little bit of background, and then I hope you will ask questions and interrupt as we go along. I want to emphasize that we are sitting in the middle of dozens of enigmas. I am not going to be able to unravel these paintings for you. I think that they were meant to be enigmas. They're meant to be something that is mysterious, not necessarily logical, rational, to be clearly dissected and have some specific meaning extracted from them. They are fantasies drawn from all kinds of sources, but particularly from things that happen by chance, that he would use chance effects and draw what might have happened by chance very, very precisely, and then elaborate on it. An example would be over in this painting on the wall, the very brownish painting, which is called Fallen Angels. You'll see on the sides of it these two cyclonic forms. Those forms came from a practice that Seligmann made of projecting glass that was cracked or fragmented through a polarizing lens, projecting it either onto a canvas or onto a wall or whatever, photographing it. And I have a couple of the photographs of these configurations that emerged, and then drawing from that very precisely the outline. So here he had something, a chance thing, and he drew it and then would incorporate it into a larger composition. Seligmann was very interested in magic. He wrote an amazing compendium called The History of Magic that was published by the excellent publisher of Knopf in 1947, before 48, and was really one of the first things of its kind, and it's been since translated into at least 4 languages and kept in print over many years. He was fascinated by magic, but it always seemed amazing to me that he started in the late 30s or early 40s using these cyclonic forms, and they appear in many paintings. I think he thought of them in a way, at one point at least, as the embodiment of what the Surrealist leader, André Breton, had envisioned when he created a new myth called the Great Transparence, and that these were hovering, invisible bodies that were around us all the time. So I think that Seligman associated these cyclonic forms with the Great Transparence. But how eerie it is to realize that in 1948 or 49, something that had never appeared in the Hudson Valley before, a cyclone swept through Seligman's property, leveled his barn and studio, and took down many trees and whatever. It just seemed almost unbelievable. It just aimed the cyclone as if he had conjured through his magic a cyclone. Anyhow, he didn't take credit for bringing the cyclone on. But so Kurt Seligman, you probably know biographical background. It's very quickly, he was born in Basel, and his family had a furniture business there. And Seligman, his first job that he had was for a photographer who had photographs on glass, and Seligman was hand coloring these glass photographs when he was about 16 years old. Eventually, he studied art at the Beaux-Arts Academy in Geneva. And then his father became ill, and Seligman had to run the family business for about 8 years and put painting aside. Eventually, he was able to free himself from that, declare himself an artist, and go to Paris. And in Paris, after first settling in for a while, he became affiliated with a group called Abstraction Création, Abstraction Creation, that was a group of international artists who were devoted to painting abstractly in leaving off the figurative element. But Seligman, and he became one of the officials of the group and was very involved with it, and began to exhibit his work with the Galerie Jean Boucher in Paris and become a figure that was part of the Paris scene in the 30s. And then he gravitated to surrealism. But even his abstract works always were based on some kind of narrative or figurative imagery concealed or disguised, or how you would say it. In the mid-1930s, and he made a trip back to Basel. He saw a big exhibition in the Basel Museum of a 16th century Swiss artist called Urs Graf, very fantastic imagery of in sort of very Gothic-looking, convoluted, beautifully. They were prints, and they were very beautifully made, and so on. And another Swiss artist, Basel artist, Nicolas Manuel Deutsch, and so he became more, we might say, antiquarian in his imagery and drawing on the inspiration of this native Basel tradition, and fusing that, in a sense, with his feeling for abstract form. And he actually then wrote an article for a French magazine called Sud on the Basel Carnival. And Basel, evidently, I've not spent that much time there, but enough to realize that it's, at one point at least it was true, that the people are quite closed in and live their lives a lot behind walls and in interiors and so on, and that then when carnival time comes, they kind of go berserk, and the streets are filled with people dancing and beating drums and blowing horns and wearing extravagant masks and headdresses, and that lasts for 3 days of wild carnival spirit. So that is echoed in some of the, you'll see a painting called La Ronde and others that is echoed in Seligman's paintings. And he, as I say, he wrote an article for the magazine Sud. And Arlette Seligman described for me the, how at 2 o'clock in the morning on the day of the beginning of Carnival, a figure appears at the end of the street in a kind of jester's costume, a large masked figure, and the drums beat, and then all of a sudden people come out and begin dancing in the streets and so forth. Now that was something that you'll find coming up occasionally in his work. Anyway, in 1939, in the meantime, Seligman became part of the Surrealist group. Abstraction Création fell apart, and he became accepted as a member of the Surrealist group, which was a very organized group at the time. They had their central office, they had their regular meetings, 5 o'clock every afternoon at a certain cafe, and they worked together on publications. And so it was quite official. You didn't just drop in, you became accepted into the Surrealist movement. And Seligman exhibited in the big Surrealist demonstration or exhibition in Paris in 1938, which was held at the Galerie des Beaux-Arts on the near the Champs-Élysées, the Rue Saint-Honoré, which was the gallery run by George Wildenstein, who happened to be the uncle of Arlette Seligman. In the meantime, Seligman had married, and he and people they believe that that was through Seligman's influence that the Surrealists could have their exhibition in this rather ornate and very prestigious Galerie des Beaux-Arts. And it was what the Surrealists, one of their aims was to really upset people, jar them out of their routine thinking and their routine paths. And so they wanted to make an exhibition that caused a scandal into this elegant place, which had just before that had a big El Greco exhibition. Came the Surrealists, 12 of the artists were given fashion mannequins and told to dress them in their fantasy, in a fantasy style. And so these became kind of famous icons of Surrealism. In the courtyard of the Galerie des Beaux-Arts, Salvador Dali had set up a taxi, which rain poured through the roof, and a blonde mannequin sat there with snails crawling over, and vegetation was growing, and one thing after another. So it did cause quite a stir, and the public, was laughing about it or deploring it or whatever. And it covered, there must have been at least 25 newspaper articles on this show, because in Seligman's papers were found he kept the clippings of all the articles covering this crazy exhibition. However, shortly after that came the clouds of war, the shadows of oncoming war. Seligman, as early as 1932, had put together a scrapbook which alternated pictures from the newspaper of military figures reviewing troops or whatever, and the hedonistic life on the Riviera, about beautiful parties and beautiful people and so forth. And he said, he injected, put it at the beginning of the scrapbook on a piece of paper, he said, "When will the next war come? For it surely will." And he went on to talk about systematic poison. And clearly, he had an anxious and perhaps pessimistic side to him. And here, 7 years or more before the war actually came, he was feeling the shadow of oncoming war. At any rate, the Berlin dealer, Karl Nierendorf, along with a number of other German dealers, also felt this ominous times and had established galleries in New York. And Nierendorf came to Paris and persuaded Seligman to have a show in New York in September of 1939. And I don't have any record of this, but I have the sense that Nierendorf knew what was, he certainly knew, as having been a Berliner, what was happening in Germany, and he used this as a way to get the Seligmans out of Europe. And although they may not have suspected that at all, people were reluctant to believe what was happening and what was going to happen. So 9 days after the German troops invaded Poland in September 1939, the Seligmans were on a ship for New York. And a whole group of paintings had been sent off for his exhibition at the Nierendorf Gallery. They left their home in the little impasse in the 15th arrondissement of Paris, called the Villa Seurat, as if they were just going for a short time. They would be back. They just walked out and left everything except the paintings that he had sent for the exhibition. And, but then soon became clear that they could not return to Europe. And they moved into a studio apartment in a building on Fifth Avenue and 40th Street. It's called the Beaux-Arts building. And then eventually, in the following months or year, they were looking for a place in the country, a sort of country retreat. And through the brother-in-law of Meyer Shapiro was a great art historian and professor at Columbia, who Seligman had met either on the ship coming to New York or shortly afterwards at the Museum of Modern Art. I have two different stories about it, and I don't know. Anyway, they became very close friends, Meyer Shapiro and Kurt Seligman. They had the same very intellectual turn of mind, erudite way of thinking about things. And so through Meyer's brother-in-law, they found a place in sort of upstate New York, Orange County, which is about this little hamlet called Sugarloaf, after the shape of a nearby small mountain. And it's about 50 miles from New York City. They found this old farmhouse, and they settled in there. They kept their place in the city, but they also had this home in Sugarloaf, which is where I really encountered this whole story. Because after some years after Seligman's death, Meyer Shapiro had asked me if I wouldn't do an article about Seligman, and because nothing had happened after his death. One exhibition at the Darcy Gallery, and then nothing, because his widow became a complete recluse, and she was not someone to sort of push herself out in the world, so in any case, so I called her, and because I was going to write an article, she graciously allowed me to come and see her. She's kind of fended off visitors. So when I went there, this wonderful little 19th century farmhouse with a family graveyard up on the hill next to it, with these worn sandstone grave markers, and the barn that had been turned into a wonderful studio, and so forth. Inside this small old house were paintings by Max Ernst, by Yves Tanguy, by most of the members of the Surrealist group, paintings or collages and so forth. It's a wonderful treasure house of artworks. A library. She always kept the door closed, but a library full of the Surrealist publications, artist-poet collaborations from the 1930s, the original copies of Max Ernst's collage novels. They've collected all these Surrealist publications, and Arlette continued when she found something to add to the library. In any case, we went down under one of the barns, which is a very old stone barn with just a dirt floor, and there was this beautiful etching press on which he had printed many of his. In Europe, artists usually had a professional printer do the printing, but in the United States, Seligman printed a lot of the prints himself. In any case, there beside the etching press were these cartons of they were soggy and wet, whatever, mildewed, of papers, letters, fragments of a lot of things with foreign postage stamps, so on. And I said, Arlette, what are you going to do with it? I don't care, take them. Why didn't you take them? She said. So I did, full of curiosity as to what was inside. And then there were a couple of more boxes that someone had taken already to a home in Brooklyn, and she told me about that. And this person didn't want them, I called them. So I went out to Brooklyn and got a couple of more boxes. And as I looked at these and took them out and dried some of them out and so on, the whole story of the migration of the Surrealists to the Western Hemisphere came to light. Letters asking Seligman's help to get them out of Europe. Could he arrange some lectures for André Breton? Could he send an affidavit that there would be support for this person, and so on. And gradually, at least 10 members of the Surrealist pre-war Surrealist group reformed in New York, and with Seligman as being the first one to come, being the kind of point of communication. When the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington, D.C., I loaned them a whole folder of all of Seligman's efforts to help bring people out of Europe and finding support for them and so forth. It was very important. There was one a Marxist aesthetician called Max Raphael, who was already in a detention camp, and Seligman managed to raise the money to buy him out of the detention camp and bring him over here. So there's that part of the history. And then there also, in this box of papers, were lots of documents connecting him with various American artists. And this is one of the things that really interested me, because at the end of the Second World War, America had emerged as the militarily and economically most powerful country in the world, and they needed a kind of an art that put them on top as a leader in the arts. And what happened was basically a rejection of any idea that any foreign art had any effect. There was a kind of chauvinism that set in, and that became one of the basic themes of the New York School or abstract expressionist movement in art. And the influence of the Europeans was totally ignored. And that's something with these documents in these boxes, including a slip of paper. Some of you may have heard me say this before, a slip of paper with the dates on which Seligman gave lessons to Robert Motherwell, who became one of the leading abstract expressionists, who never really acknowledged that he had studied with Seligman, but there were there it was. These are these documents proving it. So there was a very important impact there from these refugees, the Surrealist refugees. They organized exhibitions in New York, they had publications, and they had very pleasant, for many of them, social relations with the American artists. And one of the things that really did have an impact on artistic practice was the Surrealist use of automatism. The idea that you start with something accidental, a gesture of a brush on paper or whatever, and then you begin to, Masson was one of the first people to do this, you begin to see in that kind of hallucinatory way of finding images in it. And so the idea of the gesture, gestural automatism, I say, was taken up by the American artists, but and particularly Motherwell very much, Pollock. They went to lectures at this, Gordon Onslow Ford, the Surrealists gave. They drew from Surrealism, this idea of automatism and a kind of freedom of expression. However, one of the Surrealists later said, Roberto Mata, Chilean artist who was one of the leading spirits among the émigré surrealists, that the Americans took out of automatism They used it as a basis for developing a plastic form, but they ignored the content. There was no real content. It was all the drips and the patches of paint and so forth as abstraction. Whereas the surrealists had used it as a way to develop content, to create a kind of path to the psyche, to the unconscious, by using chance, and then developing from that. So, in any case, very important element for American art, and for what happened was this great movement that attracted worldwide attention of abstract expressionism. But to return to Seligman, and I wish you'd stop me and ask questions as I go along. The work that I said last night, surrealism was not a style. It was a way of life, a way of thinking. So when you look at the work of different surrealists, you don't look for stylistic resemblances. You look at the individual expression. And what you are seeing all around you is Seligman's individual expression. You can't equate this with work by Max Ernst or Masson or any of the others. And I find it amazingly powerful. Looking at these works, they draw me back again and again. I mean, the way they're displayed here is so ideal with this kind of light and space around them, and you see them some of them now suspended in this space. Very, very effective. In any case, they are works that you really want to return to again and again. As I said, the enigmas, you'll never really totally resolve what it is, but you go back and revisit and see more or see it differently. In any case, Seligman then here in New York was very welcomed. He was shown by very good galleries. There were writings on him. He published articles in the magazine called View, and in also the journal that Surrealists published called VVV, and was generally, quite a figure in American art, or New York City in the early 40s. Right up through till after the end of the war. And he also designed these costumes and sets for 2 ballets, early one by the choreographer Hanya Holm, and then he did one for Balanchine. And I think that some of these figures, you might even see aspects of a performer. I wondered about this wonderful one over here called the Sorceress, whether, because there's an architectural framework for it, sort of stage-like. It has a kind of, it looks like figures in a theater or something, whereas we don't see much architecture in most of the works. And it was painted after, not long after he did the work for Balanchine, and so you might have fed into this. Let's see where we go from here. He did the ballets, and then he wrote. For a few years, he was collecting rare books on magic, corresponding some of the things that were in his papers were all the letters to dealers of rare books. Even during the war, he would be sending to England for rare books on magic, 16th and 17th century books. And out of this, he put together this compendium, as I mentioned, called The History of Magic. And it wasn't just a sort of intellectual interest. It was something that he really felt, magic. And he wrote about what magic could mean to him as an artist. And he saw it as and as he delved into it, a whole way of viewing the world as a unity, where one thing would transform into another, and that everything flowed together, and the stars, the earth, people, all were part of one. All is all. I can't exactly quote it, but and I think more and more that is something that is expressed in his later works in the 1950s, particularly the big triptych up here, but some of the others you can see vegetal forms. He and Arlette were more and more living at their place up in Sugarloaf. They had flower and vegetable gardens. He wrote to his friend Pierre Coutillon in Paris. He said, "We are busy with raking leaves, gathering apples. We are true compagnards, true country people, and we like this life." So he was looking more closely, and you'll see not only vegetal forms, but insects and the idea of a kind of ambiguity, where one thing ends off and another begins, that things are constantly in a state of transformation. It's interesting that his good friend, Wolfgang Paulin, who had settled in Mexico, had also was seeing something similar in his paintings, but through physics. Paulin was a great reader of contemporary physics and a kind of believer in Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle. And in his paintings, which also, as I say, went beyond surrealism, he was trying to express the idea of matter as energy, not in the specific pictorial way that Seligman was doing. But it's interesting that surrealism penetrated both of them and led them in these directions, these parallel directions. There's a lot of parallel in their lives as well. So, would you like to ask some questions? Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about the biomorphic paintings, but there's such a range of styles in the room, and I'm just curious about the linear development of his style, and if there were specific kind of, like there was a point when he was doing these more geometric works, and then there's a point where he's doing the more biomorphic, and just if you could talk more generally about those various phases in his work.
Well, I don't. It just seems very self-evident. But I think in each phase, it related in a way to what was going on in his life. The gradual in the late 40s and during the 50s, although he did teach in New York, he taught at Brooklyn College in the 50s. But I think more and more they felt at home in their place up in Sugarloaf in the country. And he and Arlette stayed there more and more. But I think that he was looking at what was growing around him and applying his feelings of revelations that had come to him through magic and through this idea of this all-pervasive unity of everything, and trying to express that through the form, this constant transformation that you see in these are actually drawings in paint on canvas, so they're sort of in between a drawing and painting. But it's a very different kind of approach to form than you see if you're looking at, well, this one, but going back further to the work of the early 40s, which is more figurative. I mean, imaginary figures, but much more discrete units of figures, which are separated as separate forms, separate kind of existences. Whereas here, by the later 40s, after he's finished his book on magic, we have this kind of continuity from one form into another, and the idea of growth and change, the seed pods bursting and leaves unfolding, and so on. the central painting of the triptych, you'll have to look more carefully at it later. I kind of misinterpreted that when I wrote an article about Seligman in the mid-'80s, and it sort of ended with this. It's very late, 1959 or so. He died in January 2nd, 1962. So it's very close to the end of his life, and it's called Rübsal, and it's named for a Swiss or German mountain spirit who appears to travelers in the mountains. And I saw it as a kind of disintegration that might be reflective of his mood, his anxiety and pessimism and so forth. But now, looking at it united with the side panels, I see it differently. I don't see it as a sign of personal disintegration, which I thought might be one. I think it's partly a reflection of what was going on in American art in the late 50s. Abstract expressionism went full bloom. Pollock was a hero, a national hero in a way, and cultural hero. Life magazine had done a big article on him and so on. And I think that maybe one of the things that happened with abstract expressionists was this kind of all-over use of the canvas, where the forms filled the whole surface. There wasn't any distinction between positive and negative space. And in a way, it looks like Seligman is echoing a little of that in these flowing forms. I don't know. It's one of these things you look at it and you make up your own minds and see your own interpretation of it. But he also wrote to the Harvey Arneson, who was putting together a book on modern art, about dreams. He said, not for anything would I give up my dreams. And though I have the sense that what he is painting is almost a literal painting of what had appeared to him in dreams. And I think I'm not really answering your question about the phases of different phases. I just think, the way an artist evolves and one thing leads to another, and it may in many artists, what evolves is reflecting external influences from other art. I think in Seligman, as I just said, there may be some reverberations of abstract expressionism, but I don't think it was a key thing at all. I think the phases are generated by his own, interests at the particular time.
Yeah, I was just curious when those phases were. And I was just curious when those phases were, and which you've given some information about the time period that was, and what his thinking was. And for example, these three paintings over here are quite different also.
Those are pretty late paintings over there. I mean, I think, it's a question of getting used to looking at them, and you'll, can fairly well see, although sometimes he will, in the 1950s, revert back to something done much earlier, pick up an earlier theme and do it maybe in a different way. So, yes.
Martica, I would just like to make a request. We have this wonderful microphone that we can pass around the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question for the benefit of everyone else in the audience, we can hand you the microphone, and that way we can all hear the questions.
All right, this gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Ron. I think it's important to acknowledge, in terms of New York avant-garde movements, the New York Dada movement, with people like Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray. And my question is, was there any, was Seligman was influenced at all by the New York Dada movement?
I would say not. He knew Duchamp. Duchamp visited in Sugarloaf, and it was against the wall of the barn there that Duchamp fired 5 shots and photographed it, and it became the cover of the catalog for the first big surrealist exhibition in the United States, called First Papers of Surrealism. And I think it's reproduced in the book, and you can actually see it displayed back there. I photographed it when Arlette told me, because I don't think anybody knew. And Arlette said, "Well, this is where Marcel Duchamp fired his gun." So I took a photograph of it, and later on it was plastered over because people having information having been let out, people began coming to see the barn wall. So now you can't see the shots there anymore. But as far as Dada, I don't see in Seligman any of the nihilistic spirit of Dada. I think he would get along with Duchamp. Almost everybody did, but I don't think that he was. I don't think he was nihilistic in that sense or anti-art. He could not have put the work that he did into these paintings, which were really, he was a consummate manipulator of paint and exquisite. His draftsmanship is exquisite. He spent a great deal of time, and there's a whole thing that goes with one of the films that he wrote out, the dialogue for the film, which is the film of Seligman painting, which describes the techniques that he used, a series of which you wouldn't see with the naked eye, but layers of glazes would go into the, and he also used the finest materials. So he was a meticulous craftsman in that sense. And anyway, it's an interesting thought. Something I could think about for a while. He did know Man Ray. He rented his house in Paris, in the house that they had left in the Villa Seurat, to Man Ray for a time. In fact, after the war, when they didn't go back, they had Paulin rented it for quite a while. Man Ray and Noguchi all lived in that house for a time.
I had a question regarding the show. Is the exhibits hung in a different chronological order, or different? How is it set up? And also, I thought it would be really amazing if this was to go into exhibit in the future with the Magic Library collection, and having in one room the influence of the library with the pieces. But if you can talk about how this is hung, like chronologically, or...
Sure, from your lips to God's ear, right? That we could do a big show with all the library as well would be my dream, and do it in a museum would be the dream. But the exhibition that Roland and I curated, it is chronologic, and it kind of plays into what you were talking about with the time periods, in that it's not often, if we were alive back in Seligman's time period, we probably would have gotten to see only the works of the 50s, because you only get to see the work that is the most recent work that they did. Then we bring me down in my voice now. But you'd only get to see the most recent works that were happening and being created in that moment. A retrospective, the goal of a retrospective is to give you that view of their trajectory from the beginning to the end. So as you enter into the space, everything in the back, which is actually the front, it starts with the 1930s and starts to take you into the 40s, and then the 40s go in this direction to the back wall, and then when you get here and you turn around, everything here goes 50s to the latest pieces, which are those three that are over there that are the 60s. So if that answers your question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Anyone else? Andrew? Oh, I can do this.
Thank you. I was curious to know a little bit more about not just his interest in magic. Obviously, he had the interest in the history of magic, and we can see some of the visual influences. But in his life, did he actually, either in a serious sense or in an entertaining sense, practice magic? And how so?
Well, he did evenings of magic for an invited audience. There is in the book that Weinstein Gallery has published in connection with this exhibition, there is a photograph of an audience sitting around in a circle, and there is Seligman and an artist friend, Enrico Donati, and they're demonstrating magic. Now, I have no idea whether these were just sort of part. I think it was far more than pulling a rabbit out of a hat. I think he was very interested in the Kabbalah. He was. He really sensed that there were currents of things happening that you had to tap into that people didn't ordinarily see or understand in a logical way. But the actual practice we have evidence of is these evenings of magic he did in his studio apartment in the Beaux-Arts building in New York. And he sent out an announcement about it.
And a slightly related question, with the paintings that to me would evoke the magical images, there's also a very strong sense of what I would call sort of a heraldic, knights in shining armor element. And I don't know if those are one and the same thing, or in the books that he's bringing, they actually have a very English feel to me, a medieval English feel, but maybe I'm queuing up.
Well, that has to do with his background in Basel, and Stefan, who is sitting behind you, who has written the major book on Seligman, and Stefan is from Switzerland, and has dealt with that in his book quite a bit. One of the first things that artworks that survived from Seligman was a head of a knight in armor. That was a book plate, I believe. And so he was very aware of a heraldic tradition. And I think also Stephen Miller, who is also right there, has written about this. The coat of arms, there was a family coat of arms. And all these things were part of his environment growing up. And I think he wanted to attach to this past. Even maybe especially after he was uprooted in another country. Stefan and Stephen, you want to elaborate on that?
Perfectly well put. You put it very well. I don't think I can really improve on that, but I know that Seligman is, in the first thing you would see in their house when you walked in was a etching of a man called Caspar Christian Seligman, who was lived in the 17th century and part of the 18th century, and he was a counsel. He was an advisor to the Elector of Saxony, and he has a Baroque wig and flowing robes, and there's a heraldic escutcheon down in the left-hand corner. Now his name is spelled exactly with the two N's that Seligman spelled his name. It's not, as it turns out, Stefan did some research and genealogically in Basel and found that he's not a relation. But Seligman, of course, was taken with this print, and it belonged to his parents, and so there was a kind of a projection, I feel, and the heraldic device is very prominent there, and would have excited his, been a sort of an inspiration to his imagination, I would think.
Thank you. I wonder, since there's this great gap in his notoriety, or at least in the historical record of exhibitions of Seligman, who his collectors were at the time in New York, who his dealers were, and what American artists he actually hung out with, not European artists or not from his surrealist group. Was he at all interested in any? I look around, and it's not a direct thing or anything, but I'm reminded of this very strange American artist, Ivan Albright, and I wonder if he liked that type of painting.
There is nowhere that I know of any reference to Ivan Albright. I think, but it's an interesting thought because there is a lot of similarity. But I've never came across anything like that. And I had, went through everything in his library and through all these papers. So, as far as other American, you asked if he was friendly with other American artists, and I think he was. His colleagues at Brooklyn College, admired him. I'm trying to think. He was very good friends, not in artist, but a writer named Murdoch Pemberton, who was an art critic for The New Yorker for a short time. There was a lot of correspondence with Murdoch. There were American artists. There was an artist called Alfred Russell, who was very friendly with him, who Alfred Russell taught at Brooklyn College. But I don't think he was particularly interested in what American artists were doing.
Or writers, perhaps.
Well, he had
Poets, or-
associations with several poets. He did some collaboration. He did engravings for a Wallace Stevens poem. There was a poet named Clark Mills, and there was Nat Hertz, who was the poet with whom he worked on the drawings that are up here, which were was supposed to be for a published book of Nat Hertz's poems called The Impossible Landscape.
Actually, about the poetry, one of the reasons we're having the poetry night, which is on May 22nd, mark your calendars now, but the reason that we're doing it is even here, based in the Bay, Philip Lamantia at 16 leaves San Francisco and goes to New York. And Breton says of him at the time that he has a voice that happens only once every 100 years, right? So that's pretty great praise from Andre Breton about another poet. He was very young. In his writings, collected writings, he talks about that he didn't really get to hang out with Breton that much, but who influenced him the most was weekly meetings that he had with Kurt Seligman. That Kurt Seligman, it gave him access to his entire library. Now, Lamantia, of course, comes back to San Francisco after all, the Surrealists leave, and he's part of the genesis that becomes the San Francisco Renaissance. He was the first person to read at Gallery 6 the night that Howl was read for the first time. I mean, it's a part of San Francisco, but what a small world. And to have him say that's one of the reasons why we want to celebrate his association. We were all talking the other night about what a diverse guy, I mean, he's a scholar. He's doing ethnographic collecting as well as almost anthropological studying of tribes, etc., while he's doing costume design for the ballet and magic nights. I mean, this is pretty cool.
I didn't even mention his role as an anthropologist, a kind of amateur anthropologist. The Surrealists, as you probably know, were great appreciators of tribal art. And before anybody, they were collecting African carvings and so forth. And then had a great interest in the art of the Pacific Northwest, from British Columbia, and then eventually Polynesian art from South Pacific. And some of the Surrealists had great collections. But Seligman actually put it into effect. He had some independent means. He had the wherewithal to go to British Columbia, he and Arlette, in 1938, and they spent 3 months in an Indian village. And during that time, he took a lot of notes. He made very careful reports. He listened to the legends that went with some of the totems. And they actually became clan members of one of the clans in order to buy a 60-foot totem, which was shipped back to Paris and stood for many years right at the entrance of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. It's now been moved to the new Museum of Tribal Art, the Musée de Quai Branly. So this was a whole other aspect of him, but something he did with as much seriousness as he put into the care with which he made his paintings. It wasn't just sort of Paulin went later, but Paulin was following Seligman's footsteps and advised by him, but the following year. But he was more interested in what he could acquire and collect, and not into the Indians themselves. I have a manuscript of a lecture Seligman later gave on the native populations of British Columbia, which very carefully documents the size of populations of villages at the time Seligman was there and how it had shrunk, from 50 years earlier. And he was very aware of the plight of the native populations and very interested in trying to document their legends, their costumes, the whole system of the potlatch. And so he really immersed himself in that. It was a whole other aspect of the man.
Oh, Martica, I was here yesterday, and I forget what the question was. Perhaps what's a quintessential picture, what defines him? And you showed a little picture from your notebook that to me looked like a Calder or Moreau, and not like anything I've ever seen of Seligman, because I am more familiar with these images here. So I didn't know if you could explain again, or if you still had that picture,
here.
or what exactly the question was.
Is this the one?
Yes.
Okay.
See, that doesn't look like Seligman.
No, it doesn't.
No.
It comes. I
Help me.
had it because it happened to fit into my notebook and brought it along. It was done in 1932, and it's called Portrait. And it was acquired by the Guggenheim Museum, although I learned from Stephen Miller that they had deaccessioned it. It is from his period of abstraction création. This is just when he was really, the first few years of being a painter, of an artist in Paris. And but I showed it because it represents his way of thinking about imagery and narrative. It's called Portrait. Well, Seligman had gone to the Academy in Geneva at the same time as Giacometti, and he did a wonderful portrait, very realistic portrait of Giacometti, which is in the museum in Bern in Switzerland. This is a portrait. It's called Portrait. It's a portrait of Giacometti. This is a very famous Giacometti sculpture with the crescent and the dangling ball just above it, not quite touching it. And this is called. This was these are all three in the museum in Basel. This is called Head. It's just a flat slab, but Seligman has elaborated on it, sort of disguised that it was a sculpture, but also it's his way of being secretive, of hiding and yet representing at the same time. Is this, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Who else? Anyone else?
Not exactly a question, but I wanted to add, if I may, a tiny slice of information related to the question of the gentleman. I found it quite interesting that you would point out Ivan Albright, because that brought to my mind among the earliest collectors, and you also are asking about the collectors, among the earliest collectors of Seligman were Mary and Earl Lutkin in Chicago, and they actually had paintings by Ivan Albright, and since Seligman did visit them very early, even I think while they were on their honeymoon trip, and he would have seen paintings. What he would have done out of it, I wouldn't know. I don't see a direct a relationship, but at least I can be fairly sure he would have seen paintings by him.
Yeah, the Lugdens, should be a partial answer to your question. Mary and Earl Lugden were friends and collectors of Seligman's work. They lived in Chicago, but they'd met the Seligmans in Europe previously, and there was a lot of warm, cordial correspondence back and forth, and he acquired probably a painting a year. So I think Stephen Miller believes that there was a yearly stipend involved in this. I don't know how that transaction actually worked, but they were Chicagoans, and this is why there are 9 or 10 or even more paintings by Seligman in the Art Institute of Chicago. In fact, the Chicago collectors seem to buy surrealism more readily than New York collectors, and they've become wonderful collectors of surrealist work in Chicago, and now these have found their way into the Art Institute. So any other
Anyone
questions?
else?
I just want to say, maybe there are two very paintings by Seligman from the abstraction creation period around the corner. Right, yeah. Which, of course, were done at a time of the portrait that Martica showed. Right.
So I just want to say that the best things sometimes in life happen by chance. And it really was for me by chance that I came across these boxes of papers. And this was in the early 80s. And they have led me into all kinds of fascinating adventures as I sought out some of the different people. I went to talk to some of the people that had been Seligman's friends and correspondents, and it led me to Gordon Onslow Ford. That became a wonderful friendship that brought me back to Inverness time after time. And it's just been fascinating. And this is, in a way, a kind of marvelous culmination of all of that. That was that I can sit here and look at what Kendi and Roland have accomplished, and just realization of something so marvelous. And we're all very, very lucky, but grateful for their perseverance.
So in looking at, the biomorphic paintings from the 50s, and then in your talk about magic, or his work with magic, I'm curious if there are aspects of his work to talk, or his intellectual life to talk about in relationship to technology. And I know that's a very contemporary concern, not so much one of the surrealists at the time, but I mean, magic has this aspect, 19th century magic has this aspect of using new technologies to create sleight of hand and film as a kind of magical enterprise, film and photography. And then, getting into the biomorphic stuff, I mean, getting into kind of science fiction and biological technologies and such. And so those are all things kind of going on around him, but I'm curious if those relate to his thinking or his work more directly than just around him.
Well, the surrealists were very inspired in the beginning by Freud and Freud's writings, and then that gradually shifted to more concern with Jung, and this is something, but I don't think that was a major concern of Seligman's, the scientific aspect of the interpretation of dreams and all of that. I don't recall finding much reference to it. He preferred not to rationalize the way a scientific approach to the psyche would do. I think he really wanted to leave that element of mystery, to express it as a great, universal mystery in a way. But I don't know if that really answers your question.
Just because film was mentioned, you alluded very briefly earlier to a film of Seligman at work, and I wondered if that was by Thomas Bouchard, and if so, if that was realized ever fully, and if you've seen it.
When I was working on Seligman, I contacted Thomas Bouchard's daughter, Diana, and tried to find out about this film. I knew it had existed, and it was actually shown at the Museum of Modern Art. I went to the Museum of Modern Art film archives. They didn't find any trace of it. So I kind of gave up. But Stephen Miller is a very persistent detective, and so why don't you tell him, Stephen?
Well, it took probably 5 years of diplomacy on the part of myself and Stefan Hauser to get to visit Diane Bouchard. She lived in Brewster, Cape Cod, the center part of Cape Cod. And we went there finally after much letter writing, and she showed us Thomas Bouchard's film called The Birth of a Painting, and provided us with a transcript of what was said. She had it set up in her living room and with, it was on a reel-to-reel projector and a screen, and it was a very strange visit. She clearly was an unusual personality. She'd gone outside and brought in a lot of dead leaves and scattered them on her coffee table. And when I commented on them, she said that, yes, she was a very clever person. So anyway, we met. we saw the film finally, and we all clapped our hands at the end and so forth, and we were gratified to see it, and then eventually went on our way. But she died in March of 2013 at the age of 90, and her executor got in touch with me later because apparently she saved letters I'd written to her, and she was wondering, the executor was wondering what to do about Kurt Seligman. So as it turns out, my conversations with the executor, that there are 2 other Thomas Bouchard films about Seligman, so a total of 3. And apparently Diane played a cat and mouse game with lots of people who were after her father's photography archives and so forth. And I know that the executor said the grandson of Miro was for years and years trying to get the film Bouchard made of his grandfather, and never succeeded. So, but fortunately, all the Thomas Bouchard films have gone to the Harvard Film Archive in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they recognize the importance and the desire on the part of institutions and so forth to show these films. So I think in the near future that will be possible, fortunately.
To that end, Julian, we contacted them because in knowing that this exhibition will probably go on through the summer, we wanted to be able to have the opportunity to show this film. And so we had to get permission, and that was like you're going through, please understand that this exhibition is never going to happen again for Seligman, the importance of showing the film, and we received permission to show the film. But right now, it's an issue of digitizing the film so that it won't, we also don't want the film to be destroyed. So it wasn't they couldn't do it in time for the opening. Our hope is that we'll be able to show the film before we close this summer. But we also want to make sure that those are preserved properly. No better place than Harvard for that. So, that's our hope, is that we'll be able to invite you back in July to see the film with us as well.
Hello, I'm curious if you could talk about his technique about painting on glass. I noticed there's a couple of images on the wall over here that are different than many of the others.
Painting on glass.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear all of your question, Keith.
If you could talk about his technique about the painting on glass as opposed to canvas or paper.
Yeah, well, reverse glass painting is an old folk art, Swiss, Russian. Kandinsky did paintings on reverse glass where you painting on the backs on one side of the glass to be looked at through the other side. And so you sort of build the painting up backwards. And Seligman, well, I guess, again, I'd like to refer this question to Stephen, because Stephen has looked at I believe at the notebook where it describes his technique of painting on glass.
Maybe I would prefer to answer to this question, because I did some research to that, and it has to do with what you mentioned, this early, when he did colorize glass slides.
Yeah.
And that is, he developed on this knowledge. And what we see is he poured liquid gelatin on the back of the glass and would draw with ink on the gelatin. It's not on the glass, it's on the gelatin, and he does not use opaque paint, but it's actually transparent ink, colored ink, and that's why it looks different. And this is also when, you mentioned also these cracks that can happen. This is when this gelatin is drying too fast, then it creates a tension, and it can happen that pieces of glass are being torn out of the glass plate, without cracking, without destroying the plate otherwise. And so it's actually these accidents that could happen and did happen, obviously, from time to time. And these are small pieces about the size of a fingernail, which he would then use to create his cyclonic landscapes from. There's actually huge enlargements of these little cracks. There is one specimen preserved in one of the boxes, actually, in the Seligman papers at the Beinecke Library. So, who cares could go and look at it.
Thank you.
And Stephen Miller actually owns, I believe, don't you own Sabbath Phantoms?
Yes.
A painting that was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art on glass and then turned back to the Seligman family, and in somewhere it cracked. Right?
Right. Well, it was returned by the Museum of Modern Art to Seligman to repair, and it was decided at some point that the museum would be better off having a painting that was on canvas that didn't require conservation work from time to time, and so Seligman, they chose a painting called The King from 1960, a late work. In place of Sabbath Phantoms, but Sabbath Phantoms the museum had acquired in 1940. From his friend Stamo Papadaki, the Greek architect, and it was therefore the first work of Seligman's to enter the Museum of Modern Art, but it's now no longer there.
But have you ever tried to have it restored?
Yes, I have. I had a glass restorer take a look at it. Stefan was with me and we met her too. We decided it's going to require a more sophisticated conservation person than she was able to provide. Though the French call glass painting, reverse painting, I think the word is églamisé is the term, and but Seligman had his own way of doing things, as we know. So this glass painting restorer was more familiar with the églamisé restoration technique than she could figure out quite how to cope with what Seligman had done. So,
Stephen, isn't it true though that Seligman left like a tome describing?
Yes, he did. Yes, of course, being very meticulous, he left. He left instruction. He knew that his glass paintings would require restoration periodically, and he left very detailed notes written in German, Das Technik des Glasbilds, is the title, and drawn illustrations that he kept. And that notebook of instructions, and also it's an inventory of all the glass paintings he made. I think there are about 35 of them. Who owned them at the time? Anyway, that's at the Beinecke Rare Book Library, so to be consulted by conservation people.
Maybe next time we're going to have to just all fly for a weekend up to the Beinecke and go through a bunch of boxes, Anyone else?
I hope you all will, those of you who live somewhere within the vicinity will have a chance to really get to know and enjoy this work, which is going to be on for into the summer.
Yeah, we're going to extend this. I think we have no choice. Originally we had said June 13th, but it'll be up most of the summer. So we're not doing anything else. Let's keep this up. Well, it's been 50 some years. Let's keep it up. Well, you guys, let's take the last time here now to get something to drink, eat some sandwiches, and take a look at all of the art. We thank you so much for coming and joining us. It's a privilege to have you here, and it's a privilege to show Kurt Seligman's work to you today. So thank you, and thank you, Martica.